What is up, everybody? Welcome to Geek Pantheon. I am Eric, and today I have for you my review of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. First off, big thank you to Wizards Coast for sending me a copy for review purposes, and I'm excited to go over this book with all of you and talk about what I really liked, and there's a couple of things that I think could potentially be improved. But yeah, let's get into it. First off, the intro for the book. So this does a really good job of kind of breaking down the concept of horror in terms of being at a game table and some important things for both yourself as a DM and your players to think about and consider when signing up for a game of that nature. It also has a really great breakdown of Ravenloft as a whole and how the world works, I guess. Some backstory on the Dark Lords, the Dark Powers, things like that. It does get into more detail later in the book, but this gives you a good overview of what to expect in this book. And it also kind of sets up the rules for the domains of dread and the Dark Lords and the Dark Powers and how the world works, essentially, which is important once you get to chapter 3 and you start reading about the domains of dread, what those look like and how they work. One pretty disappointing thing with this book, I do have to say, is the in fiction notes and asides that we've come to expect from books going all the way back to Xanathar, of these characters that are on the cover providing their own twist on the things in the book. I think they really hit it out of the park with Tasha's Cauldron Over Everything. I thought that was extremely well done, having Tasha provide her thoughts on various things throughout the book. And in this one, we have some communication between the various mist walkers and investigators that deal with Ravenloft, but only in the intro. We only get one from each of them, and then they disappear for the rest of the book. And I really enjoy getting to see the writers play with the in-fiction thoughts on these mechanical elements. And so I, being perfectly honest, was pretty disappointed to realize that it wasn't throughout the book that they were going to be having this. And even the stuff in the intro is just in fiction discussion of their characters in Ravenloft. There's no real kind of fourth wall break, wink and a nod stuff in the in fiction stuff in the book, which, you know, isn't a huge thing if you're coming to this for the mechanics, but for the experience of reading it was kind of disappointing. And before we move on, if you are enjoying this video, please be sure to like it down below and subscribe to the channel. It does help out a whole heck of a lot. And when we hit 2,000 subscribers, which we are very close to doing now, I'm going to buy one of my subscribers a D&D 5th edition book of their choosing. So let me know down below which book you would be excited to get, and be sure to subscribe to the channel. And then chapter 1 is the character options. And it starts off with some very important discussions about playing in a horror game, running a game for players in a horror game, a bit more in detail than the intro went, and also some important heads up about how the social contract can change and be altered when you're dealing with horror and fear and things like that. Things like if one of your players has a real life phobia, don't try to use that at the table because that's not cool. I did that like back in the 4th edition days. Knew that one of my players was deathly afraid of spiders. I would throw spiders at them when I wanted to be scared. That's not okay. That's not cool. So don't do that. So it gets into stuff like that about the right and wrong ways to elicit fear and terror in your player characters and your players to a certain extent. Also, lineages have changed from their Unearthed Arcana form. If you watched my Unearthed Arcana video, you know that I had some issues with it, and they did away with the dual creature type nonsense where Hexbloods were humanoid and Fey, and Dhampirs were humanoid and undead, and just kind of creating a bit of a confusing mess for some players. So Dhampir and Reborn are humanoid. Hexblood are Fey. End of discussion, which I really like. They also acknowledge in the write-up in the book that this change could happen during play. Your character could become a Dhampir during play. And I like that they acknowledge that because that's absolutely a way that I would use these. For me, though, the standout of this chapter is the Dark Gift section. It has so many really cool and interesting options for dark gifts, which are like the supernatural gifts from Theros, but with a twist and kind of a potential downside when you roll a natural 1. And my favorite is the Living Shadow, dark gift, because there's some really cool things that you can do when your shadow has a mind of its own, but there's also some complicated things that can happen when your shadow has a mind of its own. So I really, really like that and think that that's engaging and interesting. And then we have the two new subclasses, the Bard College of Spirits and the Undead Patron for the Warlock. With the Bard College of Spirits, fans of the channel and various shows that I do will know that I am a sucker for a good random rollable table. And that's kind of the central conceit of the Bard College of Spirits is you call out to hear a story from a spirit that has a real world effect on you or an ally, and you roll on the table to see which spirit answers the call. And it even goes so far as to kind of the capstone ability for this subclass at 14th level is something that just kind of helps you get a bit more control over the random table by letting you roll twice. If you roll the same thing on both die, then you just get to pick. So this subclass is really built around this spectral tail table, which I think is a lot of fun. It's going to turn a lot of people off having one of the central aspects of your subclass being random. But for me, as an agent of chaos, I really like it and I think it's fun. And the warlock subclass is fine. Being perfectly honest, nothing jumps off the page at me in terms of this warlock subclass, especially compared to some of the really interesting and cool things that other warlock subclasses can do. The spiritual projection that you get and the things you can do with that are really interesting, but you have to wait until 14th level before you unlock that, which that's a lot of investment to get to one cool thing. So yeah, I'd probably skip over this one in favor of something else, just because it doesn't seem that engaging to me. I could be wrong. Let me know down in the comments if I'm missing something, but overall, not a huge fan. And the background section has some cool generic background features that you can slot in specifically for Ravenloft. So you could have a soldier, but give them a Ravenloft flavor kind of thing. And then there is a brand new, they reprint the Haunted One background, but then you also get a brand new one known as the Investigator, which obviously works really well in Ravenloft given the Van Richten story and all that kind of stuff. But it could also easily pivot into other games and campaigns where you want to have a more inquisitive, thoughtful character background. Chapter 2 is for creating domains of dread. And so off the jump, this chapter contains some incredible tools, lots of random tables for creating a domain of dread, for creating a dark lord, for creating adventures in the domain that you create. Even has breakdowns of every different horror genre and how to utilize those in your game, how to craft adventures centered around that genre, and even some of the more harmful tropes that lazy writers use in those genres and how to avoid them. It's a great chapter. I really like this chapter, and I think it is essential for a book like this to kind of show their work, kind of thing. Like, here's how we created our domains of dread, so you can do it as well. My one gripe: this should be chapter 3. Chapter 3 should be chapter 2. Chapter 2 should be chapter 3, because we're learning how to create a domain of dread, how to create a dark lord, all this stuff before we've seen what that looks like. We're getting front loaded with all these tools and then we're shown the examples. I would have loved if chapter 2 were the domains of dread, and here's all the different domains of dread that we have created. And now here's how to take what you now know and understand and build your own. Obviously, I know you can flip around this book all you want. It's not a linear experience necessarily, but somebody sitting down to read it cover to cover like me, I read chapter 2, was like, oh, this is all really interesting. Then read chapter 3, and then went back and looked at chapter 2, like, this all makes so much more sense now that I know what I'm looking at. So this is purely a layout issue, but yeah, I think you should swap chapter 2 and 3. So when you pick up this book, maybe after you read chapter 1, go to chapter 3, read all the domains of dread, and then look at the tools on how to build them, because I think that's a better experience personally. But chapter 2 is great. It has some great options, and if you want to do kind of a chaotic run, rollable tables for creating your Dark Lord, creating their motivations, why they became a Dark Lord, what type of adventures that you can run, complications involving the Dark Lord, all that kind of stuff. Super cool, really well done chapter. And now chapter 3, the domains of dread. So from a page count standpoint, this chapter takes up almost 50% of the entirety of this book. So this is really the meat, the core of the book. This is what you're paying for. And it's great. The first section of the chapter goes into a lot more detail on Ravenloft as a plane of existence, building off of what we learned in the intro of the book, but really getting into the nitty gritty detail of how Ravenloft came to be, kind of the lore history of it. If you're wanting to run an entire campaign set in Ravenloft, this is great information to have. And then we get into the actual domains of Dread. Now, I basically had two options when talking about this chapter. It was either give like a 10 to 15-second blurb on each one and just rapid fire through all of them, or take my favorites and talk about them. I elected for the latter. And then I realized how difficult it was to pick. I went with three, my top three, because as I was flipping through to mark the pages on my top three, I saw other domains was like, oh, but I really maybe top four, five. No, got to stick with three. So there are a lot of great domains in here covering every genre of horror story and mixing them in interesting ways. So this is a phenomenal chapter. I'm going to get into my top three favorite ones, but know that there is something here for everyone. Okay, the first one is Darkon, which is a dark fantasy mixed with disaster horror. And this is actually, I'm starting off with kind of a weird one. This domain of dread has no Dark Lord. Back before the point at which this book is taking place, an event known as the Hour of Ascension resulted in the Dark Lord of this domain, Aslan Rex, disappearing. And since that happened, the mists that surround all the domains of dread and create kind of their border have begun creeping in to the domain, blocking off different sections. And during the day, you can travel through these mists fine as long as you can properly navigate them. But at night, only a fool would step into the mists. And there's a lot of really cool, interesting mystery and intrigue surrounding what happened. Where did Aslan Rex go? Why are the mists encroaching on the plane? What needs to be done to fix it? All of these things are questions that, honestly, something I really appreciate, don't have a concrete answer in the book. They offer, once again, random tables that you can pick from, or you can just create your own. So I like mysteries that are left up to the devices of the person running the game. But you know who isn't at all concerned about the mists encroaching through the domain? People that live there. Because denial of verifiable and evident doom resulting in cataclysmic changes to your surroundings and environment need not only belong in the real world. You can have fun at your gaming table with it too. Then my next one is Dementlou, which is a cocktail of dark fantasy and psychological horror. And this one is built around people, an entire city of people trying to climb the social and economic ladders through just bald-faced lies. Everything is gold-plated in this world, and it is falling apart down to the very foundations of the city. And it's great if you have a group that loves social interactions and want to be able to do bluff checks and persuasion and all these things to try and navigate a world built on social construct, then this is absolutely a great domain of dread for them to go into. And they're all built around the grand masquerades put on by the Duchess. But if you receive an invitation and are caught appearing to be something other than what you are, well then a follow-up invitation won't be necessary. And my other favorite domain of dread is Valachan, which is a dense jungle world that still, you know, it's D&D, it's set in fantasy and all that, but who needs dark fantasy when you can just have a good old classic gothic slasher story? This domain is built around the Trial of Hearts, which is a battle royale that takes place in the dense jungle where people are trying to survive both each other and the greatest hunter in the domain of dread, Chakuna, who is out to get you. And there is a lot of really cool, interesting lore underpinning this whole domain, and even a proper adventure to kind of fix some of the problems in the domain if your party wants to do that. But it would also be equally fun to use this domain for a classic survive until dawn slasher story where you're just trying to outrun the relentless killer that is constantly on your heels. Either of those stories would be fun and cool, and I think I like this domain because of how different it feels. The idea of running a slasher story in D&D is really compelling, and they do some really cool things to make that viable. So I really like it and really think that this domain is interesting and very cool. And then at the end of this chapter, they have some really cool, like 1 to 2 paragraph, just jumping off points for other domains of dread that they didn't go into full detail on, and just provide some cool, interesting hooks for, hey, think about this. There's even one set in Eberron. For my Eberron fans out there, you will rejoice. They didn't do a full domain treatment for Eberron, but they did include one that you can build off of. And I'm not going to spoil anything with it. I think it's very cool, very creepy. I sent a picture of the section to the GM for Kyber Shards, Philip, and he responded with, well, that's creepy. So yeah, it's very cool, and I really like this section of just providing some jumping on off points that you can then go back to chapter 2 and get the ball rolling. Also, the end section of this chapter talks about the travelers that go through the mists and travel from domain to domain, and the notable figures that do that, which is great if you're going to be running a campaign in Ravenloft. This is a great section to think about potential allies for the party to come across, either when they're traveling in the mist or discovering them in the domains. So really well done chapter overall. Really liked it. Then chapter 4 is titled Horror Adventures. And so these are tools for, even if you're not going to use the domains of dread, just tools to make your games creepier, scarier, elicit that feeling of horror. It continues off of the intro with the proper discussions and questions to ask of your players and yourself when you're setting up a horror game. They even have a survey that you can kind of go through with your players and figure out really what is appropriate, what is off limits, that kind of stuff. Very important if you're going to be running a horror game. There's also a section discussing pacing in horror games and how to, when it's frantic, frenetic energy, when the killer's right on their heels, and then when to slow things down to a horrifying crawl and describe things in great, excruciating detail, how to properly evoke certain emotions and feelings when you're doing this. So really great section there. This chapter also introduces some really cool curses and how to create new and interesting curses for the game, including a version of lycanthropy that can't just be removed, cursed away, which I really like. I've always felt like lycanthropy just kind of is let down a bit by the whole remove curse of it all. So a more potent version of lycanthropy. And all of these curses oftentimes have conditions that need to be met before remove curse can be used, which makes a lot of sense, especially for a horror game. Having remove curse kind of removes, mummy stories couldn't happen in a world that has remove curse. Could be like, okay, you're not cursed anymore, whatever. So yeah, I really like that they kind of filled in that hole, cleared that gap in terms of the design of D&D, because you don't want to completely negate remove curse and say, you could, as a DM at the start of a game, say, hey, this game is built around curses, so remove curse, not a spell you can take. Okay, bye-bye. You could do that, but this also provides an option where somebody could have remove curse and get use out of it. There's just additional conditions that need to be met in order to unlock the ability to remove the curse. They also come up with fairly eloquent ways to show stress and fear in the game, which I really like. That's been something that I've wanted for a while, is evoking that sense of like the character being on their last leg, just emotionally and mentally. So I really like that. And one of the ways that a fear check can be triggered is a monster demonstrating that they could deal enough damage to one-shot a player character, which just made me chuckle because I've had that moment at tables at DM where I roll damage, announce the damage, and you just see some of the squishier characters at the table go pale face, like, oh god, like one hit would take me down. And it's cool that then transfers to the player character if you're using this mechanic. So I really like that. There's also some new haunted traps, which are really cool and interesting. But my favorite section of this chapter are the survivors. So one of the biggest disconnects oftentimes when trying to create a horror, scary game in D&D is that horror is built around inherently the protagonists of the story feeling helpless or powerless or in danger. And once you get past level 5, it's pretty hard, unless you just throw a Tarrasque at the party, to make them feel powerless, to make them feel in danger. And there's a difference between just throwing a super high level monster at them and be like, fine, here, you might die, as opposed to somebody feeling powerless in the environment and feeling like whatever comes around this corner If there is anything through this door, I am going to die. It's hard to elicit that with D&D characters. So survivors are a different type of player character. They only go up to level 3. They only do milestone leveling, and they don't have a class or a race. It's all cosmetic. You have archetypes that you can pick, and there's cool talents that you can take when you level up to inject some flavor and some more utility while still being normal, while still being a normal person in this story. So I really like that they included this. They do say it's for, shorter adventures or one shots. Obviously, you don't want to build a campaign around somebody that can only get up to level 3, but it would be pretty cool to, start off with survivors. And once they hit that next milestone after level 3, congratulations, you're now a level 1 player character. Pick your class. So that would be a cool intro kind of thing. So I really like the inclusion here. I think it will go a long way, especially for running, short adventures or one shots in a single domain. Having survivor characters will go a long way towards keeping that terrifying environment alive and well. And at the end of this chapter, there's also an adventure included for characters level first, getting them through level 3, I think. And it's fine. I'm sure for a table full of people who hadn't just got done reading chapter 3 of this book, it would be a great adventure to run. But after having gone through all of the incredibly unique and flavorful domains this book has to offer, for then the adventure included to be set in a haunted house, it was just kind of like, oh, okay. Kind of a letdown in terms of in the creativity department. Now, like I said, for people who haven't read the book, probably not going to have those hangups, especially considering this is a first level adventure designed to introduce a party to Ravenloft. It's probably better that way. Just in the moment when I was reading, it's like, oh, we got an adventure. Which domain is it set in? Oh, it's a haunted house. Okay. So it's not bad. It's got some cool lore. It's got interesting mechanics for different endings for the adventure and things like that. So it's not terrible, but for me personally reading it, I was kind of let down that they didn't flex a bit more in the writing department for the adventure. And then chapter 5 is Monsters of Ravenloft, and there are some really cool twists on existing monsters in this chapter. That's where I feel like the chapter really sings, is when you're taking these familiar things from D&D lore and providing a horrifying twist to it. There's the Loup Garou, which is just French for werewolf, but it is a version of lycanthrope that is much more terrifying, much more powerful, but also has once again another version of lycanthropy that can't just be removed cursed away. The only way that you can remove this curse is to kill the creature that infected you. And so if you get bit and then the Loup Garou runs away, you're a lycanthrope until you can track them down and kill them. So I really like that. The Relentless Killer is a really cool monster stat block for if you're trying to inject a Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees character into your game of just that single-minded, relentless, I'm going to walk after you slowly because I know I will catch you eventually. You cannot escape me. And in fact, it even has mechanics to where you can't sense their emotions because they don't have any. They only have one function, and it is to kill you. So I really think that's cool. And then the Zombie Clot, which is just literally the size category is huge mass of zombies. Like think World War Z, the movie, where it's just the giant horde of zombies clambering on top of each other. It's that, which, yikes. So as you all can probably guess after listening to all of this, my review for Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft is good. I think it's a good book. I think it is a strong addition and introduces a lot of really cool mechanics for a DM to not only inject horror into their game, but it has some really cool world building tools as well for any genre. And honestly, you could play the Domains of Dread not necessarily horror. You could have your player characters be heroes trying to go through and protect people from these horrifying situations, but have your players your player characters be above the inherent terror. You could do that. And so in that case, even if you aren't interested in running a horror game, this is still a really good book to pick up. It has some really cool lore, has some really cool characters and villains that, once again, you may not even run a Domain of Dread adventure, but you're like, I like that villain, and I like that villain, and I like that story element, and just pick and choose what you want to take. And in the over 120 pages that chapter 3 is, that is when the book is at its strongest. Like I said, I wish that the tools from a layout standpoint came after, but even so, the tools are great. The subclasses are fine. I don't know if you needed them in the book, and the adventure is once again fine, but maybe you could have put it up on the DM's Guild and use those pages for something else, injecting a bit more flavor into the book or another domain or two. I don't know if they were needed for this book to be successful. So that's the only things I didn't really like. Like I said, the Bard subclass is fine, but it's not necessary. It's not one of those things where I look and go, oh, well, this book would be incomplete without the subclasses in there. So, if this would have been just purely a setting book for Ravenloft and it like hyper focused in on, we were talking about Domains of Dread, we're talking about Dark Lords, all that stuff, then I think maybe it would have been a stronger book. So yeah, but overall, really love chapter 3, love chapter 2. Most of chapter 4 is great, and the monsters are a lot of fun. So anyway, what do you all think? Are you excited to pick up your copy of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft? Let me know down below in the comments. And if you're watching this after you picked it up, what do you think of the book? Do you agree? Or do you think that the adventure was great and that the subclasses are totally necessary? Or do you think the domains are terrible? Let me know down below. Thank you all so much for watching. If you want to be part of the conversation and talk about this video, we do have a Discord in the description down below, as well as all of our socials are down there. So thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time.